Today's topic is the phrase es gibt. Somewhat surprisingly, this phrase means there is, even though es doesn't mean there and gibt doesn't mean is. However, when used together, that's the phrase German speakers use when an English speaker would use the phrase there is. First and foremost, let's clear up which piece is which. Es is the subject and gibt is the verb. This will become very important when we start using this phrase in sentences later. So let's refresh some fundamental rules of grammar. The subject and the verb, in this case es and gibt, must be next to each other at all times, though which comes first is not essential. Sometimes we could say es gibt, and sometimes we could say gibt es, depending on the rest of our sentence. What matters most is that verbs will come second in statements and informational questions. However, they'll come first in yes or no questions. Let's look at some examples. For instance, we could say something like, Es gibt ein gutes Museum in der Stadt. This would translate to English as, there is a good museum in the city. Our subject, es, and our verb, gibt, are next to each other, so rule 1 is okay. And the verb, gibt, is in second position, as it should be in a statement, so this sentence checks out. Now, many English speakers might make this error if they started with in der Stadt. In der Stadt es gibt ein gutes Museum. We might do this because in English, we would say, in the city, there is a good museum, with the subject preceding the verb. But here, although subject and verb are together, the verb is no longer second in the sentence. To fix this, we'll have to flip-flop the order of es and gibt in order to keep gibt second in the statement. Let's fix this to avoid that common English speaker error. Now, subject and verb are still together, and the verb is second again. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the exception to the rule that verbs must come second is yes or no questions. In this type of question, the verb must come first. In fact, that's the way you know it's a yes or no question in the first place. So if you wanted to ask something like, is there a subway station nearby? You would say, gibt es eine U-Bahn-Station in der Nähe? Notice in these questions that the verb, gibt, is in first position. However, in informational questions, verbs will still come second. That's because a question word has to come first in an informational question. So if you ask informational questions with es gibt, they'd sound like this. Was gibt es hier zu essen? Wo gibt es ein gutes Restaurant? Warum gibt es ein Problem? Now that we've talked a lot about the order of es and gibt in questions and statements, let's talk about the other nouns you might use with this phrase. What's important to keep in mind is that es is the subject and gibt is the verb. Now, since we'll already have a subject in our sentence, the other nouns cannot be used in the nominative case. The nominative case is reserved for subjects, es in this instance. Instead, nouns following es gibt will be used in the accusative case, because they're technically direct objects. Here's how this might sound. Es gibt einen Bahnhof in Berlin. There is a train station in Berlin. Es gibt eine U-Bahn-Station in Berlin. There is a train station in Berlin. Es gibt ein Museum in Berlin. There is a museum in Berlin. And notice here that we're using masculine, feminine, neuter, and now a plural noun. Es gibt Discos in Berlin. Now, Berlin is a very metropolitan place. It's the biggest city in Germany. So of course it has all of these things. But, have you heard of the town of Arnis? It's the smallest town in Germany. It only has about 350 inhabitants. Now, the thing is, Arnis is so small that it doesn't have any of the things that a big city like Berlin does. No train station, no subway, etc. But there's a simple way to change our sentences to say that eines doesn't have these things. We change the indefinite article ein into what's known as the negative article, kein. The beauty of this is that where we used einen, we'll now use keinen. When we said eine, now we'll say keine. Where we used to say ein, we'll use kein. And with the plural, we didn't have a word for a, because it's plural and you can't say a discos. But you can say no discos, so there we'll use keine, with that e on it corresponding to the e that would be on the end of d, the article for plural nouns. A quick comment about the last example. We'd actually translate this to English as there are no discos in eines, not there is. But in German, you can just use the phrase es gibt, regardless of whether there is one thing or whether there are multiple things. Let's review the essentials of the phrase es gibt. When translated to English, this phrase means there is or there are, depending on how many things you're saying there are. The verb gibt must always be the second element of a statement. So if you're using inverted word order, you might say something like, in Berlin gibt es ein Museum, where gibt will precede the subject. However, in yes or no questions, the verb gibt will have to come first, as in, gibt es ein Problem? Finally, any noun following es gibt, in other words, the thing you're saying there is, must be in the accusative case in your sentence, den, die, das, die, or the corresponding indefinite articles or possessive pronouns.